You wake up and it is finished. You are in a bed in a room you only half recognize, and the light coming round the edge of the blind is the wrong color for the time of day you last remember. There is a woman in a starched cap standing at the end of the bed, and she is smiling at you, and she is telling you that you have a son, that he is perfectly well, that he weighs 7 pounds and a little over, that they will bring him along to you shortly once you have had a moment, and you say thank you, and then you go looking for it. You go looking for the hours you have just lived through the way a person pats their pockets for a set of keys, checking the places it ought to be. And it is not there. There is no gap that you can feel the edges of. There is no blur, no fragment, no half-heard voice, no sense of time having passed badly. There is a moment when somebody gave you an injection in the arm and told you that you were going to rest now. And then, with absolutely nothing in between, there is this room and this nurse and this news. The whole of it, the labor, the delivery, the birth of your own child, is simply not in you anywhere. As far as you are concerned, it happened to somebody you have never met. And the nurse tells you that you did beautifully, that it all went splendidly, that you slept. And so, a few days later, sitting up in bed with a pen, you write to your sister. That is the part I want you to hold on to. You write to your sister and to your friend across the road, and perhaps, if you are the sort of woman who does this, you write to a magazine and you tell them that there is a thing they can have now, a German thing, that it is the nearest thing to a miracle that has ever been offered to women, and that if a doctor tries to talk them out of it, they are to stand their ground and insist. You will feel nothing, you tell them. You will remember nothing. You will close your eyes and open them, and your baby will be in the room. And every single word of that letter is true to your experience. That is what I need you to sit with. You are not lying. You are not exaggerating for effect. You are reporting, honestly and carefully, on the only evidence available to you, which is what you can remember. So now let me tell you, quietly and without any decoration, what was in that room during the hours you cannot find. The blind was down because the light had to be kept out. There was cotton wool, soaked in oil, packed into your ears, because sound had to be kept out too. The bed had padded sides. There was a nurse in the room who did not leave it at any point for the whole of it because somebody had to be there every minute. And for a good deal of those hours you were not asleep at all. You moved. You called out. You had to be kept from harming yourself, and there were hands on you doing the keeping, and there were hours of that. And none of it reached you. Not 1 second of it was written down inside your head. The drug they gave you was very good indeed at one particular thing, and that thing was not taking the pain away. That was the treatment. It was called Twilight Sleep, and in the years just before the First World War, it was the most passionately demanded medical intervention in the United States. And here is what I could not get past, and the reason we are doing this one. It was not forced on anybody. Women organized for it. They held public meetings for it. They wrote and published and lectured and raised money and formed a national association and crossed the Atlantic Ocean to get it, and they were opposed very often by their own doctors. They fought for this, and they had extremely good reasons. And I am going to tell you what those reasons were, because if you do not understand them, you will not understand anything else in this story. Hollis. That is the name, and if this is the first time you have found me, let me tell you what I did for a living, because it explains why I tell these stories the way I do. For the better part of 40 years, my job was the last line on the form. Somebody died, and before that death could be filed or buried or argued about in a courtroom, a document had to be completed saying what had actually happened, and I was the man who completed it. Which meant I was not permitted the comfortable answer. I was not permitted the tactful answer, or the answer the family had already settled on in the corridor. I had to look at what was in front of me and write down the true one, and then put my name underneath it. You would be astonished how much of a working life goes on the difference between what everybody sincerely believes happened and what actually did. Not lies. Honest, decent, grieving people who are certain and wrong because the thing happened in a room they were not in. Which is precisely why this particular story has been sitting on my desk for a long time before I brought it to you. Because in this one, the person who was in the room was the patient. She was there for the whole of it, and she could not describe it either. Let me set out my rules before I take another step. Everything I am going to tell you is history. It is closed, documented, finished history, and there is no advice of any kind anywhere in it, about your health or anybody else's. I will name a drug and I will name the dose that was used, because it is on the record and because you cannot follow the story without it. And I will say once clearly that nothing here is a recommendation and that the substances involved are dangerous and are properly controlled. Medicine, ladies and gentlemen, do not try this. Obviously. And one more rule, which for this episode matters more than all the others. The women in this story were not fools. They were not silly. They were not hysterical. They were not tricked by advertising. They were intelligent adults making a rational decision about the worst physical ordeal available to a human being in their century, and they made it on the best information they had. I have exactly one principle about the dead which I have never once broken, and it is that you speak of them the way you would want somebody to speak of you. So, the problem. And the problem is not complicated, it is simply awful. For the whole of human history up to the middle of the 1800s, childbirth was, for a very great many women, the single most severe physical event of their lives, and there was nothing whatever to be done about the pain of it. Nothing. It was endured, and there was a whole apparatus of religion and custom built up around the enduring of it, and underneath that apparatus women simply went through it, often many times. Anesthesia arrived in the 1840s, and it changed surgery completely and almost overnight, and its arrival in the delivery room was a great deal slower and considerably more contested. Ether and chloroform could be used and were, and Queen Victoria famously accepted chloroform for the birth of one of her children, which did a great deal to make it respectable. But it was inconsistent. It was risky in unpracticed hands. Deep anesthesia in labor carried real dangers to the mother and to the infant, and a great many physicians would give it sparingly, or at the very end, or not at all. And a great many women therefore went through the entire thing with nothing at all. And there was, running underneath the medical caution, an argument that I want to name because it is part of why the women in this story got so angry. There was a persistent strand of opinion that the pain of childbirth was natural, and therefore proper, and that a woman who wanted to be spared it was asking for something she had no business asking for. That opinion was expressed by men who were never going to be in the position of testing it. And the women who organized around Twilight Sleep had heard it, from their own doctors, more than once. So when I tell you that thousands of American women campaigned, publicly and furiously, for a German injection most of them did not fully understand, I want you to understand the ground they were standing on. They were asking for relief from a real and severe suffering that medicine could have addressed and largely was not addressing, and being told, in effect, to be patient about it. The answer, when it came out of a university clinic in the German city of Freiburg. The underlying idea belonged first to an Austrian physician named Richard von Steinbuechel, who in 1902 proposed combining two drugs for use in labor. One was morphine, which everybody understood. Morphine is a painkiller. It dulls pain. That part is straightforward. The other was scopolamine, and scopolamine is where this entire story lies. So let me be very precise about it. Scopolamine comes from the nightshade family, the same unfriendly botanical neighborhood as belladonna and henbane. Plants people have known to be dangerous since long before anybody could say why. It is not a painkiller. I want to say that again because it is the hinge of the whole episode. Scopolamine does not reliably take pain away. What it does, in the doses used here, is interfere with the brain's ability to lay down new memories. A person under it can be awake, can react, can respond to what is happening to them entirely and appropriately, and then retain not one fragment of it afterwards. From about 1903, two obstetricians at Freiburg took von Steinbuechel's combination and turned it into a formal clinical system. Their names were Bernhard Kronig and Carl Gauss, and I will flag straight away that you will find the first man's name written both Bernhard and Bernhard, and the second's as both Carl and Carl, depending which source you have in your hand, and I have not been able to settle it to my own satisfaction, so I am telling you rather than choosing. They presented the work at an obstetrics conference in Berlin in 1906, and they gave it a name that I have to admit is one of the finest pieces of branding in the history of medicine. Daemmerschlaf, Twilight Sleep. The technique, as described in their own accounts, went roughly like this. When labor was properly underway, the woman was given an injection containing morphine, about half a grain, and a very small quantity of scopolamine, of the order of 1/150th of a grain. Something in the region of 45 minutes later, a second dose of scopolamine was given. And here is the part that tells you everything about what was actually being aimed at. Between doses, they tested her memory. They would show her an object or say something to her, and then a while later they would ask her about it. If she remembered, she was underdosed and required more. If she had no recollection of it, the level was correct. And they went on adjusting on that basis, through the labor, for as long as it took. Read that again in your head because it is the treatment in a single sentence. The end point being measured, the thing the clinicians were titrating towards, checking and adjusting for, was not the absence of pain. There was no test for that. The end point was the absence of memory. Gauss ran it on a very large number of women, several hundred within the first few years, and reported outcomes he considered excellent. And by the standards of that era, the results looked genuinely impressive. Women came out of it and said it had been painless. That was the data. That was, in fact, very nearly all of the data. Now the story crosses the Atlantic, and it crosses it not through doctors, but through journalism, and then through women. In June of 1914, McClure's magazine published an article called Painless Childbirth, written by Marguerite Tracy and Constance Loop, who had gone to Germany and looked at the Freiburg clinic and come back to describe what they had seen. McClure's was a serious publication with a serious reputation, and the article landed like a bomb. The magazine was buried in letters. Thousands of women wrote in wanting to know where in America they could get this, and the answer at that point was more or less nowhere. So they organized. Later that same year, the National Twilight Sleep Association was formed in Manhattan, and it did the things that a properly run campaign does. It held public meetings. It sent speakers out. It raised funds. It lobbied hospitals to adopt the method. Mary Boyd, one of the prominent campaigners, put the position to a hall of women about as plainly as it can be put. She told them that they would have to fight for it because the mass of doctors were opposed to it. and she was right about the doctors. American obstetricians, on the whole, did not want this. Some of that was professional conservatism, and some of it was the old and ugly conviction that women were asking to be spared something they ought not to be spared. But a good deal of it, and I have to be fair here, was solid clinical objection. The method was demanding. It needed exact dosing, repeated assessment, and a trained person in the room continuously for many hours. Freiburg was a university clinic with staff and beds, and a system built around this one technique. A general hospital in a mid-sized American city, with one obstetrician covering several labors at once and a couple of nurses for a whole floor, was not that, and some of those doctors said so out loud, and they were correct. Women went anyway. Some of them crossed the ocean to do it. There was a small pilgrimage of American women who sailed to Freiburg to give birth, and came home and told everybody, and in the space of about a year, it became one of the most discussed subjects in the country. And I want to be very clear about the character of this campaign, because it is the thing that makes it extraordinary. This was a women's movement. It overlapped with the suffrage movement in its people and its methods and its temper. It was about a woman's authority over her own body and her own ordeal, against a profession telling her she did not need what she was asking for. Every instinct in it was sound. So let me now walk you back into the room, because we have to look at the thing itself. I said scopolamine is not a painkiller. Here is what follows from that. The morphine did what morphine does, and it took the edge off, and in a proportion of cases the combination did produce something close to a genuinely comfortable labor. That happened, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But in a great many other cases it did not. The pain was not removed. The woman felt it. What the scopolamine did was to remove her from the recording of it, and to remove, along with the memory, a good deal of her orientation, her judgment, and her control. Scopolamine in these doses can produce confusion, agitation, and delirium. That is a well-documented property of the drug, and it was well documented then, which meant that the practical management of a woman in twilight sleep was, of necessity, physical. The room was darkened. The blinds were drawn or the windows shuttered, because light was stimulation and stimulation made it worse. Her ears were plugged with oil-soaked cotton for the same reason. In some accounts, a blindfold was used. The bed was padded, or she was moved into a cot with high quilted sides, and where that was not enough she was restrained with straps to stop her injuring herself against the furniture. And somebody had to sit with her continuously for the whole of it. I am going to leave the description there because you have understood it, and because the people this happened to are owed a certain amount of restraint from me. But I want to name plainly what it means. The dignified, quiet, painless sleep that was described in the magazines, and described in perfect good faith by the women who had been through it, was in a significant number of cases a long, dark, disoriented, and physically managed ordeal, at the end of which the woman was handed her baby and told she had slept through it. And there were other costs, and they were noticed at the time. Labor tended to be longer. The use of forceps went up sharply, because a woman who cannot cooperate with her own delivery has to be delivered by instrument, and morphine crosses to the infant and depresses the infant's breathing, and babies were born sluggish and slow to breathe. Those were not later discoveries. Those were contemporary objections, raised by obstetricians in print at the time. And where it went wrong for exactly the reason those doctors had predicted. It was not a technique that survived being done badly. In a hospital without the staff to watch one woman for 8 or 10 or 14 hours, without the training to judge the next dose, The method degraded from a carefully supervised procedure into a woman shut in a dark room with a drug in her, checked on when somebody had a moment. Now, here is the turn, and it is the reason this episode exists, and I want to build it slowly because it is worth building slowly. Every treatment in medical history that has ever been abandoned was abandoned because of evidence. Somebody kept a record. A surgeon counted his deaths. A patient came back and said, "I am worse than when I came to you," and somebody wrote that down. That is the entire machinery by which medicine corrects itself. Harm is observed, reported, recorded, and eventually acted upon. Twilight Sleep was, as far as I can see, the only treatment I have ever come across that was specifically designed, without anybody intending it, to disable that machinery at the source. Because who is the witness to a birth? Who is the one person present for every minute of it, from the first pain to the last? The one whose testimony would tell you whether this was a gentle sleep or 14 hours in a dark room. It is the woman. She is the only continuous observer in the room. And the treatment's second and most celebrated effect was to remove, chemically and completely, her capacity to observe. The treatment erased its own evidence. And it did something more elegant and more terrible than that. It did not merely silence the witness. It turned the witness into an advocate. Because a woman who has suffered for many hours and remembers nothing of it does not report neutrally. She reports that it was painless, sincerely, because as far as she can tell it was, and she reports it with the enormous relief and gratitude of somebody who genuinely believes she has been spared. And then she tells her sister, and she writes to the magazine, and she joins the association and stands up in a hall and tells 300 other women that they must have this and must not let a doctor talk them out of it. Every woman who went through the worst version of it came out of it as a piece of testimony for it. That is not a failure of medicine. That is a closed circuit. The harm was real, and it was severe, and it was happening in front of witnesses, nurses and doctors and attendants who saw all of it, and the one voice that the public would actually have listened to, the voice of the woman herself, had been quietly and completely removed from the conversation, using the very effect that was being sold as the benefit. You will feel nothing and you will remember nothing. Everybody heard the first half of that sentence. The second half was the dangerous one. So how did it break? It broke, as these things very often do, on one death, and on the fact that the person who died was one of the movement's own. Her name was Charlotte Carmody. She lived in Brooklyn, and she was the wife of a Brooklyn lawyer. And here I have to stop and be careful about the name, because it is a genuine muddle. In the newspapers of the time and in a great many accounts since, she appears as Mrs. Francis X. Carmody, which is her husband's name in the fashion of the period, and as a result you will often see the advocate herself listed under his first name. She had her own. It was Charlotte. In 1914, after the McClure's article appeared, she traveled to Freiburg and gave birth there under Twilight Sleep, and she came home and became one of the most visible and most effective campaigners in the United States. She was central to the effort to bring the method to New York hospitals, and she was very good at it. In August of 1915, giving birth again, in a Brooklyn hospital under Twilight Sleep, Charlotte Carmody died. Sources differ on whether it was her second or her third child, which is a small thing, but I am not going to smooth it over. Now, the crucial part, and I want to be scrupulous. Her husband and her physician stated publicly, and quickly, that she had died of a hemorrhage and that Twilight Sleep had nothing whatever to do with it. That was reported at the time. Historians who have gone through the material have generally taken the view that the death was probably not attributable to the drugs. I am a coroner by trade, and I will therefore tell you exactly what I would tell a court, which is that I do not know. I was not there. There is no adequate record in front of me, and hemorrhage in childbirth in 1915 killed women who had never seen a hypodermic in their lives. The attribution is disputed. It was disputed at the time, and I am not going to assert a cause I cannot support. But it did not matter what the cause was. The most famous advocate of painless childbirth in America had died in childbirth, and that was the end. The public collapse was extraordinarily fast. Within roughly 15 months, demand for the Freiburg miracle had very nearly vanished, and the National Twilight Sleep Association went with it. A neighbor of hers is said to have started an anti-Twilight Sleep Association. The campaign that had swept the country in a year was over in not much longer than another one. And if the story ended there, it would be a tidy story, and I am afraid it does not end there. The association died. The public enthusiasm died. The practice did not. The scopolamine and morphine delivery, in one version or another, stayed in American obstetrics for decades. It came off the front pages and settled quietly into hospital routine, which is where practices are hardest to see and hardest to shift, and it was still being done to women in the 1940s and the 1950s. In May of 1958, the Ladies' Home Journal published an article called Cruelty in Maternity Wards. It was built out of letters, and a great many of the letters were from nurses. Nurses describing women left alone for hours, strapped to beds, in drugged distress, in wards where this was simply how it was done and had been for as long as anyone there could remember. It caused an enormous public reaction and is generally treated as a hinge point in the history of American childbirth. And out of that, and out of a good deal else, came the natural childbirth movement and the campaigns to let fathers into the delivery room, and the long, slow, still unfinished work of establishing that a patient is entitled to know what is being done to her, to consent to it, and to be present for her own life while it happens to her. A very great deal of what we now call informed consent grew in the ground that this story turned over. Let me put the record on the table so you know which part of this is which. Documented and uncontested. Richard von Steinbuechel proposed the scopolamine and morphine combination for labor in 1902. Bernhard Kronig and Carl Gauss developed it at Freiburg from about 1903 and presented it in Berlin in 1906 under the name Daemmerschlaf. The method, the approximate doses, and the memory tests are in the published clinical descriptions. The pharmacology is not in any doubt at all. Morphine is an analgesic. Scopolamine is an amnesic and a deliriant, and it is not a reliable painkiller. The management practices, the darkened rooms, the plugged ears, the padded cots, and the restraint are described in the contemporary literature. The increased forceps rate and the depressed breathing in newborns were contemporary objections. Documented. McClure's magazine, June 1914, Painless Childbirth, by Marguerite Tracy and Constance Loop. The National Twilight Sleep Association, formed in Manhattan in 1914, with Mary Boyd among its public voices. Charlotte Carmody, known in the press as Mrs. Francis X. Carmody traveled to Freiburg in 1914, campaigned, and died in childbirth in 1915. Disputed, and I am flagging it rather than resolving it, whether Twilight Sleep contributed to her death. Her husband and her doctor said it did not, publicly, and said hemorrhage, and most historians have accepted that it was probably unrelated to the drugs. I am not asserting otherwise. The two accounts exist, and the collapse of the movement did not wait for the question to be settled. Also unsettled, whether this was her second or third child, and the spelling of two of the German names. And now, I would like to turn away from Brooklyn and Freiburg and turn to you carefully, because there is something here that is not about 1915 at all. The lesson of this story is not that those women were foolish. They were not. Everything about their campaign was admirable. They identified a real and severe suffering. They refused to be told it was natural and therefore acceptable. They organized, they published, they raised money. They stood up in halls and demanded that medicine take them seriously. And every one of those instincts was correct, and we are all better off that women have gone on doing exactly that. They were right about the problem. They were sold the wrong solution, and the reason they could not detect that it was the wrong solution is the entire point. Here is what I would like to leave with you. Be careful of any promise whose second half is that you will not remember, because a remedy that removes the pain can be tested. You can ask the person afterwards, but a remedy that removes the record of itself cannot be argued with, and it cannot be corrected, because the only person who could testify against it has been quietly relieved of the ability to testify. And that is not only true of drugs. Any arrangement that solves your difficulty by making sure you do not have to look at it, that spares you the knowing rather than the thing, has the same shape. It will feel like mercy. It will be reported in perfect good faith as mercy. And nobody inside it will ever be in a position to tell you what it cost. The most dangerous kind of harm is not the kind that hurts. It is the kind that arranges in advance for there to be nobody left who can describe it. So down in the comments, and I do read them, all of them, I would like two things from you. First, the factual one. Before today, did you know that the great campaign for painless childbirth in America was run by women, against the resistance of their own doctors, and that the drug at the center of it did not actually take the pain away, it took the memory of it away? I would like to know how many of you had that, because I am ashamed to say I did not, for most of my working life. And second, the one I actually care about. Have you ever come out of something, an ordeal, a procedure, a bad stretch of any kind, and told everybody afterwards that it had not been so bad, and only worked out much later from somebody else's account that it had in fact been quite bad indeed? You need not give me any details. I would only like to know whether the shape of it is familiar, because I suspect it is more familiar than any of us would like. Young Toby, my perpetually green assistant, who I keep near me precisely because nothing has yet grown a shell over him, read the 1958 article at my suggestion and came back and sat down without saying anything at all, which from Toby is a very loud noise. Eventually he said, but the nurses knew. And I said yes. The nurses always know. They just are not, historically, the ones anybody asks. Which reminds me of an old head nurse I worked alongside for years, who had seen everything the job had to offer and been rattled by none of it. She told me that if I ever wanted to know what was really going on in a ward, I should stop reading the notes and go and ask whoever had been in the room the longest. She was right about that, as she was right about nearly everything. For my part, I will go on doing what old coroners do, which is telling you the true and careful reasons behind the things we would all rather not look at closely, one story at a time, with respect for everybody in them and no false comfort at the end. There are a great many of these still to tell. If you would like to be in the room for the next one, do subscribe, and I will keep them coming. This has been the story of Twilight Sleep, of a good idea wanted by the right people for all the right reasons, of a woman waking in a quiet room and being told she had a son, and that she had slept through the whole thing, and going looking for the hours and finding nothing there, and sitting up with a pen, and writing to her sister to tell her that she must have this too. If you remember one thing from me today, remember that she was not lying. She was telling the truth exactly as she had been given it. That was the treatment. My name is Hollis. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you at the next one.